Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of what will be a series of public affairs programs on the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on Philadelphia and our region. The Union League Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Guided by the United States Constitution and the history and the values and the spirit of the Union League of Philadelphia, the foundation inspires members and others to be more engaged and responsible citizen leaders. We do this through many programs throughout the year, including programs on civics and constitutional education for high school students, publications, exhibits, through giving college scholarships to deserving future citizen leaders, and through lectures like tonight's public affairs program. During this current crisis, we've also taken on the expanded mission of the Union League Employees Emergency Fund. My thanks to all those who've donated so generously to this fund. Already your generosity is making an impact on needy employees of the Union League of Philadelphia. And my special thanks to all of our contributors, all of our benefactors, especially our Founder Circle and our Lincoln leaders. It is because of your generosity that we were able to reach over 100,000 people each year through our programs and events. And now for a few housekeeping items before we start the program. For all of us who are learning Zoom right now, please note our speakers tonight cannot hear or see you. Your mic and camera are off. We will have Q&A and the questions and answers will come at the very end. You can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We're recording tonight's program and live streaming it through YouTube and Facebook, and it will be viewed and can be viewed at any time after the program has ended. And now to introduce our program is the chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation Program Committee, Mr. Steve Target.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, John. Thank you also, Kira and Joe, for all the hard work you've been doing on behalf of all of us at the Union League. We really appreciate everything. This evening is going to be a wonderful program. We've got a great group with us. And as John mentioned, this is the first of a new series that's going to be related to the COVID-19 and its impact, particularly on our region. So tonight's discussion is going to address the economic impact to our region. I think you'll hear things such as how and when we may get back to work and open our economy, what changes we may see in the weeks, months, and years ahead, how COVID may continue to change the way we work, perhaps where we work, and potential opportunities as well. There's possibilities of some pretty dramatic opportunities for our region. So we've set up the next two events. The next program is scheduled for May 6th. It's going to be a look at the health and science of COVID in the Philadelphia region. Our host is Ed Terzansky, the chair of the board of Jefferson Health Northeast Division. He's going to have with him Dr. Bruce Meyer, president of Jefferson Health. And then on May 13th, Michael Moreland, professor of law and religion at Villanova University School of Law, will host a panel discussion on the Constitution and COVID. But lastly, before we begin our presentation and I do my first introduction, a couple updates from our president, Charlie Davidson. And you may not be able to see through the camera, but this evening I'm wearing my golf bow tie in honor of the fact that the Union League Golf Club at Torresdale will open on Friday for golf and some limited services as well. I think some of the takeout dining will be available. So continue to watch the Union League website for opportunities at Union League at Torresdale. And just today, Governor Murphy in New Jersey announced that New Jersey golf courses can also open. So on Saturday, May 2nd, this Saturday, Union League National will be open. So stay tuned for more details regarding that. I think probably most of that will come out tomorrow. So now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, Union League member and member of the Legacy Foundation Program Committee, Greg Melanson. Greg is Senior Vice President, Corporate Affairs for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, where he drives HPE's global public policy and legislative agenda and oversees all aspects of the company's sustainability strategy and global reputation. Before joining Hewlett-Packard, Greg was Chief Marketing Partner at Drinker Biddle and Reith in Philadelphia, and also took time away from the firm to serve as Deputy General Counsel to former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge from 1995 to 1997. Greg also has served in our community and many charitable, educational, and nonprofit institutions, including the American Heart Association, the National Foundation for Celiac Awareness, and LaSalle College High School. Greg holds a JD degree from the Duke University School of Law and a BA from LaSalle University. He's married to the lovely Pam and has two college-age sons, JP and Austin. Mr. Melanson, take it away.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to both you and to John Miko for putting together such a great set of panelists for this evening. It really makes my job so much easier. You always do a terrific job of informing and entertaining our membership in so many ways, and tonight's going to be no different. We really expect a lively, fun, broad-ranging, terrific conversation tonight, filled with both data and probably won't surprise you to learn no fair number of opinions. And we encourage your questions throughout. John mentioned that you have that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use it liberally. The Q&A doesn't need to be reserved till the end. If I see something pop up that I can get into conversation, I'll certainly try to do that. And we want to get people back to thinking and talking and encouraging interaction. And even though we can't do it together in the way that we might like to do down at the League House with a drink in our hands just yet, we are nonetheless going to take our shot at doing it this way. So I have a very fun role this evening. Like much of my life, I don't really need to know much of anything. I just need to surround myself with really smart people. And tonight we have just that. So I am very pleased to be joined by Charles Mitchell, whom many of you know is a member of the Union League, but also lives out in Harrisburg and is the CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation. We have Hank Smith, who is the co-chief investment officer at Haverford Trust and a frequent commentator on TV and elsewhere on financial markets. And we have Steve Mullen, who is also a Union League member and known to many of our members, not only for that, but for the considerable work he has done for our region, advising local governments, state governments, businesses, and others on economic issues. And I hesitate to use the word engaging in connection with a bunch of economists, but I think a more engaging panel you probably couldn't find anywhere on the planet, at least as far as economists go. So thrilled to have these three guys with us. And as I said, I know that you can't interrupt them, but I can and will. So feel free to send along any questions and answers, as I said, and I'll try to interrupt them. I hope they interrupt one another, and I hope we get some thought-provoking and actionable ideas that are of interest to our membership and that are a little something different than what they might see and hear on the nightly news or on cable talk shows or anywhere else. We want to really add value for our membership, and we'd love your participation, and we'd love to be talking about the sorts of things that you value. So I mentioned that we might want to sprinkle in some fair amount of actual data and information. So in that end, let me turn to Hank Smith first and ask you, Hank, I know that you spend a lot of time working in the markets, and you have among the Union League membership a number of great believers in the wisdom of markets. What are the markets telling us right now?
Thank you, Greg, and good evening to all. First, let's frame the market. The stock market is in an epic battle. On one end, we are witnessing the greatest economic quarterly contraction in the history of the country. On the other end, we are also witnessing the greatest policy response in terms of monetary and fiscal stimulus in the history of the country, amounting to about 18 to 20%. The former challenge is the reason we had the quickest bear market in history, and the latter tailwind is the reason we have had the quickest bull market. So what is really important to the market, it's not the normal economic data points, because we know for most of them it's going to be the worst ever. And it is less so in regards to earnings reports, because we know most earnings reports are going to be terrible. It really is all about COVID-19 news. And on that front, this is what the market is telling us. At the margin, it's getting a little better. The US has probably peaked. The flattening, the distancing, the sheltering at home is working to flatten. We are probably have been, not maybe in every area, but for the country, we've probably seen the peak. We're starting to see states reopen, and we've gotten some good news on the therapeutic front from Gilead Sciences. I apologize, I cannot pronounce the name of that drug. And I will mention
Remdesivir.
Thank you. I will mention one earnings report. We're in the heart of first quarter earnings season, and a lot of good technology reports, but the most important today was from MasterCard, in our opinion. And here's what they reported. Swipes of their card in the United States. So I'm just going to throw out a few figures. In the week of ending March 21st, decline of 5%, March 25th, decline of 25%, April 7th, decline of 25%, April 14th, a decline of 30%. But in the most recent week, we've seen a decline of 20%. So at the margin, it looks like the consumer is getting a little bit more interested in spending. And as states open up, I think that's going to accelerate.
Well, glad to hear it. And that's the perspective that we're getting from the markets, especially in terms of public stocks and the places in which you see Hank get a lot of action. Charles, I know you are working with a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders throughout the region and beyond the greater Philadelphia region, but back home here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. Anything that you're learning from your conversations in those arenas that might help us think about where we are?
Yeah, I'd say there's two things, Greg, and I'll give you a bad one. I'll give you the bad news first and the good news second. The bad news, you mentioned you got a bunch of economists here tonight. Well, any economist will tell you, I don't even know if I can plead guilty to that, but I can pretend, for the purposes of our discussion. Any good economist will tell you one of the most important things to think about with government policy is unintended consequences. And we've seen massive unintended consequences throughout this shutdown. And I want to say straight up, look, I don't care, I'm sure there are league members in New Jersey and there's people from Pennsylvania, whoever your governor is. I think we could all say we started off this whole situation rooting for our governors and wanting our governors to be successful, whether they were the people we voted for or whether we had other disagreements or whatever, because we need them to be successful to manage this crisis. And I would say, especially in the case of Pennsylvania, many of the things Governor Wolf did at the beginning, most of the people I work with, entrepreneurs, business leaders, would applauded, and I applauded too. But we quickly saw what you often see with public policy in terms of unintended consequences. And I'll give you guys just a really appropriate, I think, example coming from the greater Philadelphia region. There's a wonderful company based in Berwyn, the largest 55 plus community in the state, called Traditions of America. Well, what quickly happened to them when, by order of the governor, all construction in Pennsylvania was shut down, was that some of the most vulnerable people, older people, obviously, who would be moving into a 55 plus community, were headed for homelessness, because you had people who sold their old house. They had a closing date, they had all that stuff, and their new house was being built, but all of a sudden their new house couldn't be built. So what are they going to do? One of those people, the organization I worked with closely, Tom Slattery, whose wife was in chemo when all this happened. And so you can't ask for a much more vulnerable person than somebody who's in the middle of chemo and is going to be homeless. And I could give you lots and lots of other stories of how that unfolded. Now, the good news is that's getting better. Governor Wolf, I think, has listened to reason and to some of the people like Mr. Slattery, who spoke up and asked for some more reasonable measures to be put into place. And that's for the good. But what I think, truthfully, Greg, is really for the good is, my observation is entrepreneurs in Pennsylvania, including in the Philadelphia region, are doing what entrepreneurs do. They're picking themselves up. They're dusting themselves off. They are probably paying more attention to public policy than they were on the other side of this, because well-intended but bad public policies have dramatically impacted them. And they're trying to figure out, what's this new world going to look like, and how can we adapt, and how can we serve our customers and be successful again? That's the good news.
And public policy is at the core of what I think we want to get into talking about here tonight, as we think about not only where we are, but where are we going to be headed, and how do we get people up and working and get the recovery started. Steve, so much of your career has been spent in the context of helping state and local governments over the years, and businesses as well. So I appreciate your perspective from all of those backgrounds on what should governments and businesses, to the extent you're comfortable talking about it, be thinking about as they try to make the recovery that we're going to have here as fast and strong as possible, recognizing, and I think some of the fun part of our later discussion will be, we're not going back to the old way, and we have to start thinking about what does the world look like on the back end of this. I guess we got to have the conversation on how long it is until we get to the back end of this, but what does it look like on the back end of this, and what should people be thinking about as we try to get things moving so that the recovery is as fast and strong as possible?
Well, I think that as Hank and both Hank and Charles noted, the governments make collective decisions. They make decisions that we all adhere to. We make our own private decisions, but the collective decisions here, there's a real huge uncertainty. That is what's going on with the health side of things, and should we? There's a nervousness about being too timid and letting the health side go way too far, and a lot of people saying, I'd rather overdo it to make sure we take care of the health story here. And I share Charles's view that that we'll find out in the long haul. We'll find out that we really did overdo it in many cases here. But you will never ever get a consensus that being the case here. There's number one, in the public sector, collective decisions are always political. No matter what anybody says, anywhere along the spectrum, they are always political, and we will see that kind of thing. My issue, and when Hank was talking about the balance between the health story out there and the contraction of the economy and the government stimulus here, in my world, the government spending and the economy are one and the same. I think most people take a look, especially in the governments, at, hey, we're looking at what are our revenues, what are we doing here, and they don't make the link that they're completely directly connected here. And what I am noting is, no matter what, there are people being nervous about two things. One is someone says, here, we're going to do this. And someone says, well, that won't solve the problem completely. Yeah, okay, nothing will. And sometimes that'll get people like, so we shouldn't be doing stuff. We shouldn't be taking steps here. The story about the federal government's huge impact here is something that I think we'll be writing. And I take a look here now, the federal government can pump $2 trillion into the economy, and we will still have a quarterly contraction in the second quarter of 30 to 40%. So if anybody wants to take a lesson here, simply putting money in people's pockets without having economic productivity, it's a good thing because you need money in your pockets to survive and to live and everything like that. But it is not a long-term story. It's not just keep doing this, keep doing this, keep doing this. You have to actually have some production. And I think that's the ultimate story. You're only gonna have production if people get back to work. So my general view from governments are to let the work, and I don't care how slow it is or anything here, but get moving on bringing the economy back. Make reasonable value judgments and trade-offs about the safety story. Be really targeted, because we can be a hell of a lot more targeted than we are now here. And from government's point of view here, and I look at this with Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia here, when businesses start to get back to work, remember here in Philadelphia and sometimes in Pennsylvania and some places, there's a anti-business attitude to begin with. So one question is, when we start coming out of it, is that anti-business attitude going to be something that will squash or really hamper growth? Number one, and number two, will you be able to? Will you see the government's, forget about the dollars now, but will you see government's actions talk one way, but the actions are things that will put a thumb on things every time someone's moving here? And I think there's a real potential danger on that, whether or not it's directed or anything here. And I see that as a real potential downside. And a place like Philadelphia will lose, relatively speaking, if we're not careful.
Well, I think I can predict Charles's answer to your question. So my next goal here was to throw back the Mullen hypothesis out to the rest of the panel, but I see we're already there. You know, as Steve has posited, the recovery is going to sometimes be determined by the way the politicians make decisions and parse out the easing of restrictions and do other things. And so I guess I'll ask you guys a couple questions. I'll go to Charles first because I can tell he's ready to jump through the television. But I guess the questions would be twofold. One, what do we think business can be doing? And two, what do you think about Steve's hypothesis there and the ability of our business leaders and our governmental leaders to come together with the right set of policy imperatives?
You know, I can see the rules here, Greg. We're allowed to interrupt the other panelists, but not the moderator. So that's good. That's good. And now that we got that covered, we can go forward, right? But you know, look, my answer to both your questions is the same. And I love what Steve said, because to me, here's what it brings out. Massive unemployment is a public health crisis. This is the thing that I think should bring business leaders and government leaders together. Yes, even in a place like Philadelphia. The fact is that being pro public health means being pro opportunity for workers to earn a living and sustain themselves. And I mean, I'm sure many of the people watching have read the same things that I've read. You know, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal this weekend that every day in shutdown and isolation is for the average person is like smoking 15 cigarettes. You know, in the world that, I mean, I'm from Delco. I love the Philadelphia region. I pay a lot of attention to it, spend a lot of my time there when I'm allowed to leave my house. But I also pay attention to our whole state. And just to give you an example, you know, in one of the counties near where I live, there have been 10 times as many deaths throughout the shutdown due to opioid overdose than there have been deaths due to coronavirus. Now, does that mean coronavirus is not a public health crisis? Of course it's a public health crisis. And I sent my people home before the governor told me to. But we also have to take seriously the fact, and I think government leaders have to and will, I think, take seriously the fact, and I think Governor Wolf is taking seriously, for example, the fact that massive unemployment, especially that goes on and on and on and on and on and on, is one of the biggest menaces to public health that you could possibly imagine. And I would argue, you know, that even those of us who, for example, you know, come from the business community or whatever you want to call it, in making the case for a responsible reopening, we are not being pro-business. We are being pro-worker. We are not balancing public health against the economy. We are being pro-public health, because if we don't change some of these, and you know, look, we can fight about what was done in the past, but my view is the past is the past. We can't change it. All we can do is find responsible solutions that work for our region and our state and our country and our world now. And my argument would be, Greg, if we talk about it that way, if we make the case that what we're asking for is actually the best thing for workers and it's actually the best thing for public health, that's how we come to decisions that are going to be best for our region.
In an environment where there's not a ton of trust out there. Hank, do you want to follow on that? I have a particular question I want to ask you, but feel free to follow on Charles.
Quick two observations. For those critical of the policy response, both monetary and fiscal, you have to ask yourself, what is the alternative? And the alternative was a very quick and deep depression. So I think we have averted that. And the lessons learned by the Federal Reserve back in 08 and 09 were we should have done more and we should have been quicker. And this time they did a lot more and they were super quick. And the government shut this economy down. That's never happened. So the government needed a powerful response. And it's remarkable how quickly a $2.2 trillion spending bill was passed. And of course, there are going to be mistakes. Now, with regard, Charles was right about pro-worker. We also need to be pro-corporations, both small businesses, medium and big businesses, because corporations are going to need to inspire confidence. That is what's going to bring the consumer back. It'll be gradual, but to a level of normalcy in terms of consumption. And talking, for example, with a restaurateur in Philadelphia that everyone has been to his sports bars, he didn't need to be told to reduce occupancy prior to the governor's order. It was just common sense. Coming out of it, when he's allowed to open, you better believe the disinfectant sprays will be prominently displayed as the highest concentrates that you can get. He has to inspire confidence for his customers to come back, and that comes from businesses.
Yeah, that comes back to the wisdom of markets, right? People don't need to be regulated. They're going to do the right thing because it's in their own enlightened self-interest. While I have you, one other question, and it's along a line of a series of questions I'd like this panel to start thinking about and talking about, sort of enough about how we got here and the current. Let's start thinking about the world beyond. And I forget whether it was Steve or Charles that mentioned the law of unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences that I feel is going to come out of this thing is that some weaknesses in long existing business models are really going to come under great examination and pressure. And I can think of no better example of that than higher education. And wanted to talk to you a little bit about it, especially since Philadelphia is a city of colleges, right? We've got the Big Five, the City Six. What if we come out of this with the Little Two? I think the world of higher education and even other forms of education are going to be under an immense amount of pressure and scrutiny. And I'm interested in your thoughts, both about that particular trend, and I'd love the panelists to also think about what that might mean for Greater Philadelphia, which has such a group of eds and meds throughout its very core.
So just quickly, prior to this crisis, one of the big drivers for the improvement in the economy was the deregulation. We had become overregulated, and for the past 3 years, we kind of rolled that back, and that was a big driver. It would be a shame as we get through this that we re-regulate. I think we have an extraordinary opportunity to regulate smarter, and I think of two areas. Greg, you mentioned education and healthcare. I mean, the FDA should be restructured immediately, and I think this crisis is showing that. But I know Steve and Charles have a lot of good points here.
Yeah, Steve and Charles, do we see a world of pain coming for higher education? Do we see bankruptcies and consolidations and mergers and a going away of a number of institutions we've known for a long time?
I think you're going to see a rethinking of education at every level. Yeah, if I were if I were the president of a small struggling college, I'd be very afraid. A lot of these institutions are run on thin margins. They don't have the strength of endowment that obviously a Harvard or some of these places have. And all of a sudden you've created this circumstance where people are being charged, pick whatever the number is, tens of thousands of dollars a semester. They're being sent home, and they're being told also, as I'm sure many listening know, that they may not be able to go back this fall. And yet they're being charged all this money, and they're being told that they can learn. Well, I think you can't help but think that some people might actually take the memo and say, oh, maybe we can learn this way. And I think the disruption goes way beyond higher education. For example, I mean, take K-12. And we all know what happened in Philadelphia. There was a significant period of the shutdown when the schools in the city said they basically weren't going to educate anybody. They quickly, thankfully, took that back. You may think that was just a Philadelphia thing. It happened across the state. It happened in hotsy-totsy suburban school districts in places like Bucks County. And now you've got still a lot of parents who are in a very difficult position and are having to totally rethink what education means. They moved to thus and such a neighborhood and paid the high property taxes because they thought they were going to get this great thing. And all of a sudden it's been disrupted. I think it's going to change the way people think. I also hope that it changes the way government thinks. Hank mentioned all the things that we're stimulating down in Washington. My argument is, if we're going to stimulate stuff, why don't we stimulate education? When we've disrupted people's lives like this, what more appropriate time could there be? And I don't care if it's done in Washington or Harrisburg or Timbuktu or all of the above, to take some of the stimulus or whatever you want to pick, some of the unspent monies from, whatever the schools haven't done over the last few months, and put it in an account so that parents could have the flexibility to meet their children's educational needs in whatever way they see.
That
By the way, if
presumes
they
there's
don't
some
do that,
That presumes
what
there's
I'm
some
afraid of.
unspent money. I think those institutions would probably tell you, believe it or not, that they're operating at a loss even when they keep the unspent money, which raises the question of whether that business model really is sustainable.
It does. And here's the other thing, right? I mean, you mentioned, the K-12 sector and how that might impact the city. And I totally agree, Greg. Here's the other thing. Are you ready for a massive spate of private K-12 school closings? Because I'm afraid if nothing is done, that's coming to this region as well. And that's scary.
Steve, unless you got something specific, do you have something specific on that?
Yeah, I wanted to know two things there. One is as you guys pointed out, higher ed was under sort of what's the future of higher ed to begin with, and now here's an experiment that I don't know who would have wanted to try here, that everybody's trying, everybody's paddling around. I Zoom on Tuesday, I Zoom a class on Tuesday night, and I Zoom a class on Thursday nights here. And I'm watching, I get the daily, what's going to happen in the fall. We're going to be open in real life, or is it going to be more Zoom classes? Number one. And then number two, as you pointed out, Greg, here, for a place like Philadelphia, literally tens of thousands of students coming to the city. One is the short-term economic impact of that across all of the facets of the marketplace, number one. And number two, the notion that one of the things where Philadelphia has been doing very, very well in the last decade or so, reversed 3/4 of a century of decline here. And even though a lot of people didn't believe it, its growth has been really, really strong. And a good portion of it is because of the nature of the higher ed, the technology that comes off of it. So and everything in the world's relative. So if everybody gets zapped like this, maybe we all just clump down. But if it was one of our relative strengths and it gets hammered more than, or question marked more than the average industry, then we're going to suffer more. We're going to suffer disproportionately.
Good. Well, that leads right into where I wanted to take you anyway, and it happens to coincide with the question that came in from what former President Bush might have referred to as the interwebs. But one of our former presidents has asked, what are the potential upsides for our region? And I know, Steve, that drafts right into your strong set because you're an optimist and you're always thinking about what are the advantages and disadvantages of this region as we respond to different kinds of trends. I want to talk with this panel about a lot of those. One might have to do with commercial real estate, working from home trends, et cetera. But in response to that question, are there any particular strengths to the region that you would see that position us better to come out of the backside of this than other regions?
Yeah, I would say I would note three things, because I still am an optimist, even though getting my head banged by 2x4s like with everybody else over the last 2-3 months, and questions about what's going on in the future. I am a believer that the ultimate reason for density and sort of the reemergence of the older central cities in the United States. I'm not talking about the Houstons of the world where you can live 55 to 60 miles away from downtown Houston and you're still a Houston resident. Okay, here I'm talking about the older, smaller central cities like Philadelphia. Here, the density and that world is attractive to more people, and it is economically, it adds efficiencies and things that are we used to call them intangibles, but now they're tangibles, and so it's very strong. I still see that winning out, but after a while, because a lot of people are you're going to have to get your sea legs.
I happen to agree with you, but I saw a Goldman Sachs study today that pointed to millennials moving to the suburbs to avoid the density of big cities. I actually think that's a strength of ours. I think that's actually a place where we gain market share from New York City because they want to leave cities like New York, but they want the relative lifestyle and livability and walkability of our city. But go ahead, I interrupted you. And by the way, I've also been interrupted by several league members who want to know at what point in time the sun actually goes down and you're going to reach out that window and take the flag down.
I have a light on it.
All right.
The world, that your point about sort of multiple alternatives is really important for Philadelphia, for the Philadelphia metropolitan area here. And I think it is one of our big strengths. But a lot of the growth over the last half century has been essentially half of the growth of the metropolitan area outside of the city has been people leaving the city. Now people are moving into the city. So instead of being a net minus 2% every year from the city, it's now a plus 2%. And the whole region is stronger for that. And I think that that's something that will continue even with some type of a hiccup here now. So I think that that's one of the things that keeps me very optimistic.
Hank, we haven't heard from you in a while. What about upsides for the city? And what's it feel like, by the way, to be in Center City? What are there going to be restaurants in Center City? Are we going to be, what is it? What's the world look like?
Well, I too am an optimist, and I say don't ever sell the consumer short. Don't ever sell the United States short. It will take a while. We will be in a period, a new normal period, with distancing, with masks. But ultimately, I think what Philadelphia has to offer will remain attractive, incredible, colleges and universities. And that's true throughout the state. I think from a state level, we're very, very fortunate that we have a flat tax and that it's virtually impossible to raise it because, one, it's flat, and it's impossible to change it because it's in our Constitution, and it's highly unlikely you could get 2/3 of both houses and the governor to vote to change that. That is a huge benefit relative to our neighbors to the east and north, New Jersey and New York. I think our state will come out better.
I just got a great question that came in over the wires here that is a really insightful thought about pressure on the pharmaceutical industry to reshore production to the United States so that they're not beholden to China at a time where we're moving into a retreat from globalism, a world in which increasingly nations will need to line up behind the United States or behind China. And we want to reestablish our independence from that. What's your view of where we head from that? And I don't know whether anyone on the panel has a take on where the next batch of legislation coming out of Washington, D.C. might go, but might we see incentives for manufacturing back here in the United States? And might any of those benefit, if not the city of Philadelphia directly, Pennsylvania? And Charles may have a take on that down the road in terms of Pennsylvania policy, but
I'll know one thing. I do think we will see that onshoring. And then we were talking about that about 10 years ago. People were talking about that when we had Pennsylvania with the shale energy, and sort of, hey, one of the things that was one of the reasons why we had such high costs was energy. And now we've got this possible thing. Will we see reshoring and stuff like that? But I would always note to people that just because stuff's coming back into the United States, then it becomes where inside the United States, and the relative attractiveness to a location matters. Whatever, no matter, I've taught public finance now for close to 40 years. And I've always heard, whether it's academic or some, regulations and taxes don't matter. And I'm like, yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. And that's something that everybody's going to be watching. And by the way, everybody across the country is going to be watching that, because this is a potential new source of growth here too. So I think we've got to be very, very careful about that.
Regulations and taxes don't matter, said no one who ever was an entrepreneur ever. And Hank, I loved what you said about Pennsylvania. I'm going to call you tomorrow. I'd like to hire you because I could use another lobbyist to help keep that state income tax from getting raised. It's you wouldn't believe how many fights there have been over that. But here's what I would say, guys. One of my views is the other side of an opportunity is a threat, and vice versa too. So many of the things that we've talked about that are challenging and that are bad news are also opportunities. I agree. I think there is going to be an intense desire to reshore things. I think there is going to be a newfound skepticism of China. I mean, you look at the polling; it's not rocket science to say that. I also think, unfortunately, I mean, I don't like obviously what's happening in New York, but I think that Greg and Steve are both right. Yes, people are going to want to move to the suburbs, and guess what? When you live in New York, the suburbs means Philadelphia. So that there is, I think, and I don't rejoice in New York's troubles, but I think you guys are right that there's going to be a lot of people wanting to have a more, simple life, but still have some urban benefits. And what's the most obvious place for that to happen? It's Philadelphia. And even on some of the other stuff we've talked about. I mean, I was honest with you guys, and so was everybody else about some of the challenges, potential challenges, and even disasters that are out there in education. But I also think that's an opportunity for us to begin to think differently about, well, what do we want out of education? What does it mean? And what should it cost, whether that's at the K-12 level or the higher level? And if we're willing to have that conversation, whether that's families around the table in terms of what they're going to do, or certainly in government policy, it gives us the opportunity to do what entrepreneurs do, which is to reinvent and to reinvigorate and to change and to make things better. And I'm with Hank. I don't ever bet against America. What we tend to do, I think, I've been reading a lot of Civil War history lately, which I hear is a thing at this club. I've been reading a lot of Civil War history recently, and to me, it underscores the number one principle of American history, which is we try every wrong approach, like Abraham Lincoln did with his generals, before we try the right one. But we eventually get to the right one. And that's why I would agree with Hank. Don't bet against America. It's going to be messy. We're going to screw it up. We've already screwed this one up a whole bunch of different ways. But I think we are going to adapt, and I think we are going to get it right.
Hank, I saw you trying to jump in there for a second.
Well, we didn't screw it up in terms of allowing this to delve into a depression. So, we can always look back and say we should have done this and we should have done that. But, with respect to education, if we're going to do more online education, do we really need the bloated administration that litter K through 12 and colleges? We really don't. How many deans are there at the University of Pennsylvania, for example, that are just administrative? I can tell you at Yale, there are over 20 deans of diversity, as an example. So I think there is wonderful opportunity to become more efficient. It's not going to happen overnight, but I believe it can and will happen over time.
Let's just jump back for a second into the into economics realm. That stimulus package, sizable, and as you said, there was package 1, 2, 3, 3.5, 4.0 on the way. What's the likely follow-on effects for our ability to sustain this kind of spending, and what effect will it have in the markets? And by the way, will we see similar things coming from state budgets as well?
So
by the way, that wonderful question sounds very eloquent because it was not mine. It came from the web.
So the short and honest answer is we do not know. So let me give you some recent history. Coming out of 08-09 with QE1, QE2, QE3, the extraordinary consensus was it was going to lead to inflation and perhaps hyperinflation. That didn't happen. As well, if you go back 20 years and when you had a deficit of $3 or $4 trillion, and you said, in 2020, we're going to have a deficit of 23 or $4 trillion. But don't worry, interest rates are going to be really low and there's not going to be any inflation. I don't think I'd have a job. They would have fired me if I had made that prediction, but it was the right. So the answer is we really don't know. But in all likelihood, there'll probably be some higher taxes. I hope not, because we need GDP growth to grow our way out of this, just like we grew our way out of the extraordinary deficits that were built to win World War II. And then the economy was allowed to take off, and debt as a percentage of GDP came down over the ensuing 30 years. We need an environment where we can sustain above average growth.
The screen seemed to predict that I was going to move to Steve Mullen. I saw his giant face appear before.
Yeah, I'll note too. What I was suggesting, what I was trying to suggest earlier was with the sort of new macro theory story that that deficits and debt don't matter and it's zero cost here. My basic point is pumping money into income, but not leading it to or not having it generate additional production, as opposed to bare subsistence for a group which has to get it, is not a long-term solution. You asked a question there. Will the state? I didn't know whether you said will the states. Will it be to the states or from the states? Because now one of the big things is what's going to be happening to helping out the states. Philadelphia on Friday, the mayor will introduce his revised 5-year plan and budget. Here, the city controller a couple of days ago came out with a report that estimated between 450 to $750 million of revenue losses for the end of this fiscal year, which we're in the last quarter, and next fiscal year. So for 5 quarters, $750 million of reduced taxes there. They're not going to. And one question is what will the feds do? And I know the macro battle is everybody. It's a classic story of here. There's a don't let a good crisis go to waste. We've had all kinds of problems here. The Fed's doling out money faster than you can even tally zeros to the right of to the left of the decimal point, I guess here. So we're going to fight. We're going to see some fighting on that. But I do think that the state and local governments won't really have the ability to do anything but try to shore up as quickly as possible. And part of my comment, I think, throughout all of us on this is that the way you shore things up is to get your private economy back working and running. There's no long-term, more Band-Aids, more Band-Aids, more Band-Aids. But I do want to know one thing. Before all this, before the pandemic, there were some big issues in the country that we talked about a lot. Income inequality. What's the story with workers? What do we do with poor people? Those issues haven't left the table just because they're not being talked about 26 hours a day on cable news here. They are still completely and utterly in the public's frame of mind. It's going to, we're in a presidential election and over the next few months here. And so the views that we're talking about here is not necessarily everybody's views of what's the proper post-pandemic state here. And that's one of the things we take a look at, because I do think there's going to be differences. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of adjustments, especially cities and certain states that are going to require, that are going to lead to slower growth, but maybe different types of growth here. And we ought to be ready for that. And we ought to be cautious to try to not let that get too strong. But there's no way we're not going to have to address those issues. Those issues have not gone away. I will note one thing here. My view is when people are writing papers and explaining this, blaming people over the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years here, one of the things we're going to find is that the people and groups that the people in governments now think they are helping may well be, because of what's happening, may well be those that are most hurt by what's happening now. Yeah, they would be most hurt in the education world. They would be most hurt in the low skills and the employment world and things like that here, because we're not focusing. We don't understand that connection too well. And I think that will be a sad commentary, unintended clearly.
I was going to say, back to the law of unintended consequences. Just got a question in over the wires, which I think we'll throw out to the entire panel, certainly interested in the Commonwealth Foundation view on it. And it's one of those rare ones where I actually have a point of view and some experience. And the question is, what effect might the pandemic have on globalization? Is it possible that we'll see a retrenchment and a retreat from globalization? From my perspective, I see that as a given. That's been happening for some time. And I see a dramatic retreat from globalization, a diminution in importance of the European Union, and a full-on situation where we have people choosing sides between the United States and China over the next series of years. It'll be interesting to see where India goes. The one exception to that, of course, in the life sciences world, I do think scientists sharing of information liberally and trying to do the right thing by people is a current state of affairs and will continue. But from my perspective, globalization is starting to become in the rearview mirror, sadly, for some period of time. And I think that's starting to be reflected in trade rules and regulations and a variety of other factors. Anybody else on the panel have a take on that?
Yeah, you know, when you look at China, China was losing a lot of, some manufacturing because they were no longer the low cost producer. There was cheaper labor in Vietnam. And when you think about a lot of the manufacturing that has left the United States, it was all to go to lower cost labor. If we are going to be onshoring, and I think we are, certainly with industries that are deemed more critical, like the pharmaceutical industry, I think it has some inflationary implications because we have higher cost labor. But I don't think globalization is going to end. I do believe that when you look at emerging markets, for example, what you're really looking at is the creation of purchasing power. In other words, a creation of a middle class. And I would hate to see that trend end because it has tremendous implications for global growth. Yeah, I think in the near and maybe intermediate term, there's going to be a questioning of the globalization that's occurred over the last 20 years, but I don't think it's going away.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering if I can do a little bit of a lightning round that combines two things. One of the trends that I think is the most interesting for us to think about is this work from home phenomenon, which I think everybody seems to agree is going to have a devastating impact on commercial real estate. And I'm very interested, and I think a number of our members would be interested in understanding whether folks on the panel have a view on what that means for Center City. How will Center City feel given the pressure on commercial real estate, restaurants, hotels, office space, et cetera? That may, depending on your answer, become a bit of a downer. If you could combine it with thinking about what do you see as the greatest opportunity for the region coming out of this, that'd be a great way to help us end. Anybody want to go first?
I'll take a whack at it. The surprise, surprise. I do think that there's going to be a big hiccup, but I also think that that there's going to be a time when it comes when people aren't as nervous and aren't as scared in the aggregate. There's always going to be people who are going to be saying I can't do this. I think we're going to get back to what we consider to be normal from February and before, faster than a lot of people think here, and people will figure out new ways of doing stuff. So I'm not ready to write off the Center City real estate. No question, short and intermediate term, really, really tough. But you might remember 25 years ago, people were saying, we're going to telecommute. I'm going to sit in a big easy chair and have buttons. My legs are going to atrophy, and the next generation is not going to have legs because we don't need them. We're all just sitting and pushing buttons and everything like that. And that didn't work. In fact, the telecommunication, the ability to have that communication made the intangible even more important. And I still see that as winning out. It's going to be a rough ride before that, but I also see the landlords and the restaurateurs and the Mouseketeers and the retailers being, as my two colleagues have mentioned here, being very creative and very don't count them out. We're always like, what's the exact solution in the public policy at the time? What's the solution? Well, people are already figuring out those solutions. And frankly, most of them have already, and many people have already figured out what's the new world. And the new world doesn't have to be worse. And I don't think the new world has to be non-dense center cities.
All right, so it's markets again, not unexpected from our favorite economist. Charles?
You know, Steve said a lot of wise things there. I would just say this. There's a lot of talk right now about the grocery store. I haven't been to the grocery store in 6 weeks, and not because my wife goes for me. Because
It's in that suit now.
there's this thing called Instacart, right? Now, who would have thought? I never would have even imagined that I would get my groceries on here, and somebody would just bring them to my door. And I offer that just to say, I think specifically, the Philadelphia region has a choice. Is it the Instacart choice, meaning are we going to find new ways to attack familiar problems and also the unfamiliar problems that are introduced by COVID, which, by the way, I mean, I'll go on record here. I don't think normal is coming back. I mean, you take the club that we're participating in right now, even in this sort of strange way, right? I mean, what would we normally be doing 5 minutes from now, which a lot of us are feeling itchy right now because we can't do it? We would be standing in close quarters with a bunch of people over 55, drinking alcohol, which, sounds really good right now, smoking cigars. Yeah, I have to believe things are going to look different. We have to confront that. And the question is, can we face that and can we adapt? Can we take the Instacart approach, or are we going to take the flamingo approach, right? Head in the sand, rear end up in the air. Of course, as we said earlier, my bet's on America, and yes, my bet's on markets, and my bet's on dynamism and on individuals figuring out, and companies and everybody figuring out how to adapt to this new environment. And that's what we have to encourage and make possible from a public policy perspective.
Hank, what's left?
And I'll just make two quick observations. I can't wait to get back to the office. Okay. Although we've demonstrated we can be very productive working remotely. And part of that new normal is going to, we're not all going to come back to the office at once. We're probably going to come and rotate in thirds, and employees that have grade school kids, they're going to be continuing to work at home. And that's why it's critical that we get kids back into school this fall. So I think a lot of people feel the way I do. They want to be in front of people. They don't want to be working from home, although we can do it. The second observation I'll make is whenever you have crises, recessions, it tends to accelerate trends that are already in place. And this is really true in the retail industry. So you're about to see a wave of bankruptcies that probably should have happened several years ago. JCPenney is going to go bankrupt. Neiman Marcus is going to go bankrupt, to name two high-profile ones. And unfortunately, there could be a lot of small businesses that are not going to be able to reopen. A lot of small restaurants, for example. And but that's just part of. And it sounds so cold, but it's part of creative destruction. You don't map it out this way. They will be replaced. And new restaurants will open, not immediately. And you just have to believe in the I'm dyslexic, the dynamic economy that we have and the entrepreneurs that we breed.
Well, I agree with you. I want to thank our panelists and leave you with a hypothetical that may cheer people up, which is, what if one were to imagine a place where you could be close to a major metropolitan area, but you could have the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, just steps away, and yet your club could have a restaurant steps away as well. And there was going to be golf just moments away in a world-class facility being considered by your club. Wouldn't that be a great thing to come out of this incredible pandemic? Great thing to think about. Anyway, let me leave you with that happy thought. John Miko, any final words?
Greg, that's an absolutely perfect place to end, because I don't know all the answers, but I know someone that has some of the answers, and that's our general manager and our leadership at the Union League. And I don't know what we're going to look like, Charles, 6 months from now or a year from now, but rest assured the Union League will be doing well. It'll be different, but we're going to do everything we can to get back and rolling as soon as possible. I know that Greg already has a tea time down at UL National on Sunday. I think Steve Target does as well, and we're ready to go. And as soon as given the okay, the Union League will be in a position to jump on getting back to work and back to serving our members as much as we can. So, gentlemen, Greg, Hank, Steve, Charles, this was a fantastic program. I thank you for your time and your knowledge and your willingness to share it with our members and with others. And I want to remind everyone that this is just the first of these programs. I hope we don't have to do too many, but we're certainly going to be doing a few over the next few weeks and probably months. We have one next week, again, May 6th, with Ed Trzanski and Bruce Meyer about the medical aspects and the science of COVID. And then the following week, we're going to do one on COVID and the Constitution, some of the issues that we're dealing with individual liberty, federalism, executive power. There's all kinds of good stuff to talk about, and we should be talking about, and we'll do that on May 13th. Also, the Legacy Foundation is transforming almost all of our programs to a digital, virtual format, and so our library hour on May 12th will also be online. Go online and check out how to register for those. Again, gentlemen, my thanks for your time and your knowledge, and to all the people that have been watching, thank you, and we hope to see you at our next program. Good night.
Thank you. Okay.